92%. That's how much of the cocoa inside a bar stamped Belgian chocolate has never actually touched Belgian soil. And it's not because anyone broke the law. It's because the word Belgian on that wrapper was never protecting what you think it was protecting. And once that rule got exposed, an entire industry started using it to its advantage, quietly, for decades. If you believe a Belgian chocolate label means the beans, the recipe, and the company all trace back to one small European country, wait until you see how many of those pieces have already moved somewhere else, sometimes without changing a single word on the box. So what is that label actually protecting if it isn't the place? And where does the chocolate inside it really come from? To understand how that gap got built in the first place, we have to go back to a small shop in Brussels in 1912. Rewind further, and the story gets even messier. The praline, the thing most people picture the second they hear Belgian chocolate, was not invented by a centuries-old guild passed down through generations of monks. It was created in 1912 in a small Brussels shop by a chocolatier named Jean Neuhaus, who came from a family of pharmacists and reportedly began by coating medicine in chocolate to make it easier to swallow. The candy shell survived, the medicine did not. Within a few decades, that single shop's invention became the template the entire country's reputation would eventually rest on, long before anyone thought to ask where the raw cocoa in it had actually come from. Fast forward to today, and that question is sitting right in your hand. Pick that bar back up for a second. Turn it over. Somewhere near the barcode, there is a small line that says Product of Belgium, or Belgian Recipe, or nothing about location at all. Just a lion, a castle, a name that sounds like a village outside Bruges. Ask yourself what you think that label is protecting. A place? A soil? A river valley the way it works for wine or cheese? It is not. And once you understand what it actually protects, the entire chocolate aisle starts to look different. Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly. Champagne can only be called champagne if the grapes grew in that one region of France. Parmigiano Reggiano has to come from specific provinces in Italy, or it is just Parmesan. Belgian chocolate has no such rule. There is no protected geographical status locking the name to a border. What ties a bar to Belgium is not where the cocoa was grown, not even where the bar was wrapped. It is a process, a recipe, a set of technical standards that Belgian chocolatiers fought for decades to define, precisely because geography could not save them. So where does the actual cocoa come from? Almost none of it grows anywhere near the Atlantic coast of Western Europe. Cocoa needs heat, humidity, and rainfall patterns that Belgium has never had in its recorded history. The overwhelming majority of the world's raw cocoa, by most industry estimates well over half, is grown in West Africa, concentrated heavily in two countries, Ivory Coast and Ghana. That bean travels thousands of kilometers before it ever meets a Belgian machine, if it meets one at all. And that "if" matters more than you might think. In the 1990s, Belgian chocolate producers realized something uncomfortable was happening to their own industry. Foreign manufacturers were stamping Belgian, or made in the Belgian tradition, on bars produced in factories that had never seen Belgium, using recipes that borrowed the name without the substance. The response was not a lawsuit over geography, because geography was never the legal foundation. Instead, the Belgian Chocolate Association built something closer to a technical charter: minimum cocoa butter content, specific conching times, defined processing methods that supposedly separate a real Belgian-style bar from an imitation. Which creates a strange loophole hiding in plain sight. If the protection is about process and not place, then a factory in France, Poland, or even outside Europe entirely can, in theory, produce chocolate that legally qualifies as Belgian in style, provided it follows that technical recipe. Some of the largest names in the industry already operate exactly this way. Barry Callebaut, Born from the merger of a Belgian chocolate maker and a French one, now runs production facilities across dozens of countries, from Brazil to the United States to parts of Asia, supplying couverture chocolate that ends up inside bars carrying Belgian branding worldwide. There was even a moment back in 2010 when Belgian producers tried to close that loophole for good. A group of confectioners pushed for the European Union to grant Belgian chocolate a protected geographical status, similar to what Champagne or Parmigiano Reggiano already had, which would have legally tied the name to the country regardless of process. It never gained the traction needed to become binding EU-wide law, and the technical charter, based on recipe and method, not soil, remained the only real standard the industry could enforce. Whether a fresh push for that protection could succeed today is a question worth checking, since food labeling rules across the EU have shifted more than once in the years since. Now here is where it stops being a technicality and starts being personal. At least if you have ever bought a box as a gift and felt good about where it came from. Godiva, arguably the single most recognized Belgian chocolate name on the planet, founded in Brussels in 1926, has not been Belgian-owned since 2008. It was purchased by Yildiz Holding, a Turkish conglomerate that also owns brands you would never associate with chocolate at all. Ownership moved. Production expanded well beyond Belgian borders. The name, the crest, the story on the packaging stayed exactly the same. Does that make it fake? That is the uncomfortable question the industry does not want asked out loud. A chocolatier trained in Brussels, using a Brussels-developed recipe, producing bars in a facility in another country, is arguably making something more authentically Belgian in technique than a random small factory physically located inside Belgium using shortcuts. Authenticity in this industry was quietly redefined from a place on a map into a set of instructions in a manual. Nobody voted on that shift. It simply happened, decade by decade, as the economics of cocoa made grown in Belgium a mathematical impossibility from day one. So why does the myth persist so hard? Partly because we want food origin stories to be simple. A castle on the wrapper implies a small workshop behind that castle. A phrase like Belgian recipe since 1912 implies unbroken lineage in one location, when in reality, the bar in your hand might have been conched in a facility 3,000 kilometers from Brussels, using cocoa grown 3,000 kilometers in the opposite direction, following a formula that was only ever Belgian on paper. The romance sells. The supply chain map does not. There is a second, quieter reason the myth survives, and it has nothing to do with marketing at all. Even chocolatiers who genuinely trained in Belgium, who genuinely respect the craft, depend on a global cocoa supply chain that has faced serious scrutiny over the past decade, including concerns raised by labor and human rights organizations about conditions on cocoa farms in West Africa. Several major chocolate companies, Belgian branded or otherwise, have committed to certification programs and traceability pledges in response. Whether those commitments are fully met is still debated among researchers who study the cocoa trade, and that debate rarely makes it onto a shiny gold wrapper next to a castle. Ask a supply chain researcher why this is so hard to fix, and you will usually get the same answer. Cocoa passes through so many hands between farm and factory that a single bar can contain beans from dozens of different farms, sometimes from more than one country, blended together before anyone assigns them a certification label at all. Traceability programs try to follow the bean back to a specific cooperative or farm, and progress has genuinely been made compared to a decade ago. But independent audits of these programs have repeatedly found gaps between what a label promises and what can actually be verified on the ground. None of that complexity fits neatly on packaging designed to be read in the 2 seconds before something lands in a shopping cart. It gets even stranger once you zoom out to the ownership layer sitting above all of it. A Belgian-founded, Belgian-recipe, Belgian-branded chocolate company can be owned by a Turkish holding group, financed through Swiss capital markets, sourcing cocoa through West African cooperatives, and manufacturing part of its output in a facility in Poland or Germany simply because it is closer to the largest customer base in mainland Europe. Every one of those countries touches the bar before it reaches you. Belgium, in a strict physical sense, may never touch it at all. Try this test the next time you are standing in the chocolate aisle. Look for the words Belgian recipe instead of product of Belgium. That single phrase is doing a lot of quiet work. It is a manufacturer telling you, in language most shoppers skim right past, that the formula is Belgian, even if nothing else about the bar is. Some brands are careful to draw that line themselves, right there on the packaging, because they know exactly how the legal standard works and would rather be precise than get accused of misleading anyone. Most shoppers never notice the difference between the two phrases, which is exactly why the phrasing works. Put those pieces next to each other, and the picture gets uncomfortable fast. The cocoa is African. The technical standard is a Belgian invention, legally defined by process rather than geography. The ownership is frequently international, sometimes Turkish, sometimes American, sometimes a Swiss-listed conglomerate. The factory could be almost anywhere with the right machinery and the right license. The only thing guaranteed to be Belgian is the story printed on the box. Which brings us back to that bar sitting on your counter. You are not wrong to enjoy it. The craft behind Belgian-style conching and tempering is real, painstaking, and genuinely difficult to replicate badly. But the next time you reach for something wrapped in a castle and a coat of arms, ask the question the industry would rather you did not. Are you paying for a place, or are you paying for a story about a place that stopped needing to be true decades ago? Because once you see it in chocolate, you start seeing the same pattern everywhere else on the shelf. Olive oil, labeled by a country that mostly bottles it rather than presses it. Cheese, named after a region it was never aged in. Coffee sold under the name of a port city it merely passed through on the way to your cup. Chocolate just happens to be the version of this story wrapped in gold foil and a coat of arms, convincing enough that almost nobody stops to ask the question before they unwrap it. So the next time you reach for that castle on the packaging, you do not have to put it down. Just know what you are actually holding. A recipe born in a Brussels shop in 1912, perfected over a century by people who genuinely earned the craft, running on cocoa grown thousands of kilometers away, inside a company that may answer to shareholders on 3 different continents. That is not a scandal. It is just the truth behind the wrapper. And that is usually where the real education begins.